Welcome to section 2 of chapter 15. I'm wearing the black hood of doom because things are going to get even worse in this section. Now, remember in 15.1, we talked about how people were uncertain and nervous about things, and they were right to be because about 10 years after the war, everything's going to fall apart again. All right. But the early 20s, like the 1920 to 29, there are some good times, all right, but not in Central Europe. Okay, now in Central Europe, remember there had been four empires there, right? There had been the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, the German Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and those all went kaput, to use a German word, after World War One. And so you did a map on this. You saw all those new countries in Central Europe that were carved out of the empires, and they're replaced with smaller countries that are supposed to be organized as much as possible around cultural and ethnic lines, and they're all told that they're going to be democracies now. Okay, um, and these things are called collectively as the successor states. All right, so here you have Poland, where part of Russia and Germany used to be. You have Lithuania, Czechoslovakia, the smaller Austria, the smaller Hungary. And we have all these little states in Central Europe who are brand new in the 1920s. And they really don't have any history with democracy. People don't take to democracy right away, regardless of what we may think as Americans. And so they have little experience with representative government, and it's messy, as you'll learn, as you can watch during this year. Democracy is messy. And so they go to elections, and no candidates win a clear majority. And so they get something that you can't get here in the United States for reasons you'll learn later. A coalition government. Nobody wins an outright majority, so a bunch of people take their groups of votes and they agree to work together. And those last for anywhere from months to a couple of years. And then the coalition falls apart. You got to have another election. It's a big mess. It's a big pain. And so there's frequent changes in government, and things are unstable in these countries. And these people will not really be wanting to stick with democracy when times get rough. And they'll go back to having strong, powerful leaders. They don't want to be involved because it's just been chaos. And so democracy is not going to last in these places for very long. The most significant of these new democracies is in Germany, which is now called the Weimar Republic. And Germany had had a little bit of representative government, but essentially it was ruled by the Kaiser and the German nobility and the military. And they don't have a lot of experience with democracy, but they're going to try. So, in the city of Weimar, a new democratic government sprung up, and for reasons we'll talk about when we get to and the rise of the Nazis, it negotiates Germany leaving World War I on not favorable terms, and they have a lot of serious problems. They're very unpopular with a lot of the people, very unpopular with the military and the veterans, and also they owe a lot of money. You remember from the Versailles Treaty back in chapter, what was it, 13? Germany has to pay for the whole war, and that's going to come to a lot of money, okay? Around $18 billion, which back then was a lot of money. So the government has to pay this debt back. They have to pay all the money they borrowed from their own people during the war. They have to pay all sorts of workers and government employees. And so what do? The one thing governments can do, they just keep printing money, okay? And they print money to pay for all of this stuff. And as you know, whenever you increase the supply of something, you decrease its value. So the more paper money there is, the less it's worth. And we call that, of course, inflation. All right, now, look at this graph here. At the end of the war, one gold mark was worth about one paper mark. So 1 to 1, okay? A mark backed with gold versus a regular mark. And to give you an idea, before the war, one German mark would equal about a U.S. quarter, right? 4 marks would get you $1. But as they keep printing more and more money, by 1923, look at this, it goes from 1 to 10 to 100 to 1,000 to 10,000 to 1. 1 million marks would equal 1 U.S. quarter, Okay, and look how the rate of increases as well. Then we get 10 million, 100 million, a billion, 10 billion, 100 billion. Finally, by 1923, if you could get them together, it would take 1 trillion paper marks to equal the value of 1 gold mark or 1 US quarter. And so this goes beyond inflation. This is called hyperinflation. And this is where you not only lose faith in your currency, people stop taking it. The money literally is not worth the paper that it's printed on. And people won't trade real stuff for fake money. And so all of this money essentially loses all its value. And we get all sorts of interesting historical pictures like this, where the children tie it together into blocks to have something to play with. They use the money for kite paper to fly kites. But ultimately, it's a situation like this, where this woman is trading 3 baskets of cash for a cabbage. All right. And so the money literally is worthless, and people ultimately burn it to stay warm in the winter. All right. When this happens, you have to start over. You have to get a whole new currency, basically start over to get people to trust in the financial system. And this actually is carried out or assisted by this guy, an American banker, Charles Dawes, good friends with President Coolidge. And he goes over to Europe and arranges essentially a bunch of his American banker friends to loan lots of money to Germany. And with American loans, Germany revives, their economy revives, and they begin trading with the rest of Europe once again. Essentially, Germany owed all this money. They owed it to France and England. France and England owe the United States all this money they borrowed during the war. If Germany can't pay back France and England can't pay back the U.S., so the U.S. loans the money to Germany to pay back England and France, which pays back the United States. Now, it seems like a big, risky, circular system, and it is. Okay, we'll get into that probably tomorrow. But temporarily, the German economy gets better, and Germans go back to work, and Germans like to work, and they're very efficient, and the German economy, by the second half of the 1920s, is doing pretty well. So, having economic problems pushed back a little bit, they're worried about political problems. Okay. Oh, there's Dawes. There's Charles Dawes, known for wearing itchy suits, as you can see in this, and the world's least fun grandpa, but a great banker and partial savior of the German economy. So now we're worried about going back to war. And so we have a series of meetings. We don't have them. The Europeans have them. And they're in a place called Locarno, which is in Italy. Because back then, and we'll learn about this guy in the next unit, the most popular politician in all of Europe was the Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini. Okay, he's the guy in the middle there. Okay, and he hosts a peace conference, and he gets France and Germany to sign a treaty saying they'll play nice with each other forever. And the terms of this treaty are kind of silly. Essentially, the rest of Europe says whoever attacks first will join the guy that got attacked. And so Britain and Italy will join in either with France if they get attacked by Germany, or with Germany if they get attacked by France. And that makes people think there might be peace. It's actually ridiculous and leads us more into World War II, but more on that later. After the Locarno agreements, the Europeans are nervous. The United States, as you'll learn next year, we get out of Europe and we go back to doing our own United States thing on our own side of the world. And the Europeans, especially the French Foreign Minister, François Briand, they agree that the United States needs to be involved in Europe again to avoid future wars. And so with he calls a conference together with the American ambassador Kellogg, and they signed the Kellogg-Briand Pact, in which about 23 nations, they pledge that they're never going to resort to war again. There won't be any more wars because we'll solve everything in the League of Nations, which the U.S. and Russia are not in, but we'll never have war again. So that's nice, and people start to feel better. And we go along throughout the 20s until we get to 1929. And there we get the financial collapse that's going to bring about the Depression, and the Depression that's going to bring about the Second World War. Okay? The economic leader in the world back then was the United States. Before World War I, the United States was the biggest industrial power in the world. After World War I, after Europe had destroyed itself, the United States is the biggest industrial power, bigger than all the rest of the world put together. And so it's hugely economically powerful. And so what happens in the US is going to affect the whole world. And the economy of the 1920s is, on one level, seems very good, very prosperous. Like we looked at the end of the last section, there's lots of consumer goods available. People have record players and vacuums and radios, and they go to the movies and all of this. But underneath, there are some serious problems. One of the problems is a lot of this stuff is bought on credit. People are borrowing money to buy stuff. And the wealth from this economy isn't distributed evenly. The wealth gets concentrated in the very wealthy, and the large masses of people who buy the large masses of stuff are gradually getting poorer and more in debt. And so this is going to all create a problem by the end of the 20s, where we're going to get what we now call a crisis in consumption. Our economy depends on us buying stuff. And we will buy stuff as long as we have the money, or we can borrow the money to buy the stuff. But at a certain point, we will stop buying things, at least things that we don't necessarily need, like radios and vacuum cleaners and washing machines and movie tickets. And then we get a crisis in consumption. In other words, people don't have enough extra money to buy the stuff that factories and businesses make. And so we get a surplus. Okay, here's a warehouse full of stuff that hasn't been sold. And then this is going to back up into the rest of the economy, because why would you pay people to make stuff if you have warehouses full of stuff? And so the factory owners cut back on production. They lay off workers. Those workers then don't have money to buy stuff, so more stuff piles up. Okay, and then when those workers lose their jobs, other workers lose their jobs because they stopped buying things. This also happens in agriculture. Actually happens first in agriculture. We get, for the first time, large-scale mechanized agriculture that can make lots and lots of food. And ultimately, the farmers are producing way more than people can eat. And so prices on farm goods, on produce, fall. And many farmers cannot repay back the loans that they use to buy their farms or expand their farms or buy this cool new farming equipment. And they can't pay back the loans, and they're going to lose their land to the banks. And so a lot of farmers, like if you have to read, what's the Steinbeck book? Grapes of Wrath. You had to read Of Mice and Men in 9th grade. You might read Grapes of Wrath later. A lot of farmers lose their farms and they head west to California, to places like Fresno and Bakersfield. And then, to make matters worse, a giant natural disaster happens in the Midwest, and we get these giant dust storms that blow the over-farmed topsoil, pick it up, and dump it on farms. And so much of Kansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska look like this, just arid, dry places. You can see here, this farm and this Model A are pretty much covered in dust and dirt from these giant storms. So our food production then falls off, and we get a crisis in consumption of food and consumer goods. So the ultimate trigger, now these problems in the economy had been there all along, but sort of, hopefully, unlike today, but maybe not, these flaws aren't noticed by a lot of people for a long time. And what makes people notice that things might not be as good as they thought is the actual financial collapse, okay, of the stock market. So the stock market crash, what does that mean? It means the values drop fast. You've lived through this. You were very small, but you have lived through this back in 2007. And that was the second worst economic collapse in U.S. history. The Depression was the worst. You were alive during the second worst economic collapse in history, and congratulations, you made it. So what happens? Well, throughout the 20s, stock prices were soaring. Okay, people were buying these goods, whether it was on credit or not, it didn't matter. And stock market prices are soaring. Let's make that our bonus keyword for these notes. Let's make it SOAR, S-O-A-R. Circle that, highlight it, underline it. It's SOAR. And so essentially, you could buy stock, and the stock always went up. You'd always make money. So more and more people want to get into the stock market, even people that don't have money. And people want to sell stock, so they'll loan you the money to buy stock, just like they'll loan you the money to buy a washing machine or a radio. But in stocks, this is called buying on margin. And when you buy on margin, you're borrowing money to buy stock, and you're using the stock you buy as collateral on the loan. Now, in 1929, the experienced investors, the ones who have been doing this for a long time, they start to sense that the market is at its peak. Its prices aren't going to go up anymore, and that's when you want to sell. And so the experienced investors begin selling their stocks, and that starts to push prices downward a little bit. And that creates panic selling, in which by October 29th, 1929, the people who knew what they were doing start selling. Then the new people, the noobs in the market, they see that the people who know what they're doing are selling. They begin selling. Then everybody begins selling. Okay, and we get a stock market collapse. And you'll see here in this graph, okay, it's at a peak right here. This is something called the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which is the top 60 corporations all on an average, their stock price. And we go from here, we plummet by October down to here. Billions and billions and billions of dollars just cease to exist, okay? This money that was in evaluated stock, and when the stock prices fall, money doesn't have to obey the laws of physics. Money can cease to exist, and money can be created out of nothing. So it's a tricky thing. But billions of dollars disappear. And as we'll talk about in the second half of these notes, this collapse in the United States, because of the circular structure made by that guy Charles Dawes, when the U.S. collapses, it's going to take Europe down with it. That also happened in 2007 and 2008. But essentially, we're going to get this. This is from the Klamath News, so that's in Washington State, so it affects the whole country. And you see stocks lose $10 billion in a day. Disappeared. It doesn't have to go anywhere. Money can just cease to exist. And there are really lots of bad news that day. Okay, largest break in history. All the wealth of the banks unable to check the drop. So there's a crisis in the banking system as well. And the bottom's really going to fall out. And in fact, this isn't even the worst it gets. The stock market crash in 1929 signals that the good times are over, and we're really not going to hit the bottom for 3 more years. It'll be 1932 before we get to the bottom of the Depression, and things start to get better slowly. Okay, so that's what we'll pick up with next time.